You know, sometimes we don't always ask the right question. Harold Kushner published a book back in 1981 titled When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And in the book, Rabbi Kushner shares the story of his son Aaron, who at the age of 3 had been diagnosed with this very rare disease called progeria, or rapid aging. What that meant was, as he began to grow up, he would get no taller than 3 feet, that in fact he would lose his hair and take on the appearance of an old person and would likely die before he reached his teens. And he did. And Kushner shared in this book watching his beautiful boy grow old before his very own eyes. His struggle with the injustice of it all, his wrestling with a reconciling and loving and powerful God, with this reality of death of his innocent and beloved child. Now, one of the things Kushner points out in the book is that really he never could come up with a satisfactory answer about why bad things happen to good people. So that's why he titled the book with a more appropriate question: when bad things happen to good people. He wrote, when we understand that our question will change from why do we have to feel pain to instead, what do we do with our pain so that it may become meaningful and not just pointless, empty suffering? Rabbi Kushner wrestled with the right question. In theological circles, among the hallways of academia, there is often a struggle in theology in an area called theodicy, which tries to reconcile and wrestle with the question of evil and the question of when bad things happen in a world around us. How do we understand that in relation to our vision of God, our experience of God as a God of grace and love and compassion? How do we make sense of suffering and death in our lives and the world around us? And you might say, in some ways, that question may feel a little bit too on the nose, as we experience in our lives these days an unprecedented disaster. In the midst of our lives with this pandemic, over 100,000 people dead, people losing their livelihoods and homes, their life savings, the very arbitrariness of who gets sick and who dies, young and old, male and female. And then we add to this immense suffering and grief, the suffering of an African American community, the decades of oppression and violence because of the color of their skin, the pain of mothers and fathers weeping over the bodies of their sons and daughters killed by those who were sworn to protect them. So we can understand that anger and suffering and grief as they stand in protest, fists raised in the air. So in some ways, we cannot ignore the question of suffering and pain because it's right there in our face every day. The number of cases we see on our TV screens, hospitalizations, deaths, the images of protests, suffering, and grief. Reminded of that song, Buffalo Springfield, there's something happening here. What it is isn't exactly clear. I think we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look, what's going down. So I do think it appropriate that we struggle along with Job with what it means to suffer and what we do with it. Now, many of you may not know is that Job is thousands of years old. In fact, many biblical scholars think it is the oldest book in the Bible. Job is mentioned only in one other passage in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, which was written about 600-700 years before the birth of Christ. And it was a reference in the book of Ezekiel. It seemed to indicate a sense that Job was a man of antiquity who was known for his righteousness and faithfulness. And the book of Job is not a historical record. In fact, it's part of what we in the Hebrew scriptures is known as the wisdom writings. So the book of Job is not intent to record some kind of historical event, but in a way, it's a fable, a story, wrestling with very human experience. And the truth is, I find some solace and some sense of connection to the writer of that story, to the teller of that story, thousands of years ago. Questions about suffering and pain have been part of our human experience from ancient times to these very challenging days. We're not alone in struggling with the question of suffering and pain. So the first two chapters kind of set the stage for us. There's Job, who's an amazingly righteous and faithful man who has this prosperous life. And then there's this conversation in the heavenly councils between the accuser and God, in which the accuser poses a question, a particular kind of question for God. He asks God, would Job love you and be faithful to you if his life wasn't so good? So let's take all the things that make life good. And I bet Job will curse you and most especially not love you. So often our mistake when we approach the book of Job is we think, well, this is going to help us answer that theodicy question, what is the source of evil and suffering and pain in the world? As if we had to look beyond the human soul for that. When really the question posed by the book of Job is a question about love. Will Job love God even when things are bad? Is there such a thing as love that is not self-interested? And in a way, it turns the question on us as well. It's the right kind of question to wrestle with. Do you love God because God gives you what you need, good things and rewards for that love? Are you really faithful and righteous out of love for God or because you expect things from God? Now, in reading that and wrestling with that question, I often think, and we're often critical of a theological movement here in the 20th, 21st century called the health and wealth gospel, because it expresses this brazen idea that if you're faithful, God will reward you. If you affirm God, God will give you all kinds of things. And conversely, punish those who suffer for not being faithful. And the very ridiculousness of that assertion we probably would challenge, but if you think about it, do we really love God for God? Or are faithful to God for who God is, or are we expecting something from God that would meet our needs? Whether that assertion is, well, I can avoid hell by loving God. I can try to be faithful because I know I'll have a good feeling if I'm faithful. In some ways, the challenging question the accuser makes to God is a challenging question to us today. And the interesting part of this introduction and in the coming weeks is that Job appears to pass the test quite well. But even in these first 2 chapters, we begin to see a shift in Job, a movement with his suffering. Because the first chapter ends with these words, "In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with anything." But at the end of the second chapter, it says, "In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." It's a subtle thing, but Job is being changed by his suffering. And the truth is, the rest of the book is about that change. The truth is, Job loves God enough to curse God. And we'll see what Job does with his suffering. And I will posit to you that in the end, Job not only continues to love God despite his suffering, but ultimately loves God in the midst of it. So really, Job is about what, much like Rabbi Kushner's question, is what do we do with our suffering? And is that really an important question? And I would say it is. That it isn't some theological idea to be debated in a Sunday school class. It's not some question to ponder in meditation. That actually, it's at the heart, that question, what do we do with our suffering, is at the heart of our faithfulness, our humanity these days. Because that's the question facing us now. What do we do with our suffering? And the reason why that's important is because, first of all, we have to admit their suffering. That what's happening these days more and more is we're trying to stick our head in the sand and not see it. Reports over and over again that we don't really want to know what's going on in the nursing homes. We want to go back to our normal life. And the problem with that, of course, is if we don't admit the suffering, more people are going to die. And the other thing about doing something with our suffering is the realization that it actually can make us more compassionate and caring. I posit and have thought about this, that in many ways the response of our country, of many in our community to the protests and the Black Lives Matter, which has been going on, these protests and this organization has been working over decades in response, that in some ways maybe part of the reason that we're responding more is because we know and have experienced suffering, softened our hearts, opened us up to other people's suffering. It's maybe made us wiser. What do we do with our suffering? And how do we love God in the midst of that suffering? That's not just a theological question. It's a question for each and every one of us in our spiritual lives. Because if we can admit that suffering it exists, if we can open our hearts to the brokenness of the world, we will change the world and ourselves. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.